The young and the restless spoilers Kyle had always believed he could outrun regret. That if he moved fast enough through deals and dinners and carefully choreographed reinventions, then the ache of what he lost with Claire would smear into the distance like lights on a rain-slicked highway. But grief is stubborn and humiliation is its own kind of ballast. And the moment he understood precisely how Audra had maneuvered him, how she had nudged a rumor here, erased a context there, and ushered a well-timed photograph into the bloodstream of a restless media cycle until Claire was left staring at a version of him that was crueler, shallower, and more transactional than anything he could explain away, something brittle inside him hardened into purpose, the sort of purpose that starts as self-defense and ends as a vow. He told himself he was seeking balance, that since Audra had tipped the scales he would simply press back, but the story he rehearsed alone was a poor mask for the rawer motive he couldn't speak aloud. He wanted her to feel stripped of power the way he had felt stripped of love. The first days were all controlled calm, immaculate suits, a polite nod in the executive corridor, a meeting attended with surgical civility where he complimented a memo he hadn't read. He didn't deny it when friends suggested he was fine. Denial would have been a confession. But when the meeting ended and the doors slid shut and the elevator's metallic echo folded him into privacy, the fury rose like heat off asphalt, and with it a clarity that startled him. Audra operated on momentum and proximity, thriving inside the nervous system of a company where key cards open everything except the conscience of the person scanning them, and Kyle had learned enough about her habits to know the spaces she trusted. The undecorated conference room at the end of the 6th-floor hall where reception audio never worked, the fitness center late at night when she ran too hard and left her phone in a cubby with a habitually predictable number, the maintenance stairwell that no one used except during fire drills. He memorized these in the same way he once memorized Claire's laugh, and there was something obscene about the substitution that he noticed and chose to ignore. The plan that formed in him had the elegant viciousness of something he could pretend wasn't violent because it used no blood, no weapon, no words. It relied on the architecture of a life Audra had designed for ambition and on the blind spots she wore like perfume. He borrowed a storage room through a shell arrangement that would not return his name on any invoice for at least 3 months, left a chair in the center as if staging a photograph of emptiness, tested the hinge on the door twice, and stared at the square footage for so long that the windowless walls began to feel like a confession booth constructed from plaster instead of wood. On the day he moved without hurry. Audra had exited a meeting with Nate, all polished smiles and whispered plans, and Kyle let 20 minutes pass before he intercepted her in the corridor with the bland urgency of a colleague who needs a signature on a document that cannot wait. She followed him through one door and then another, not noticing the way he kept his body angled to shadow hers, and by the time she recognized the wrongness. The too quiet hall, the industrial smell of a space used for things people would rather not see, he had already nudged her across a threshold and closed the lock. He did not hit her, he did not shout. He told himself this distinction meant something, that restraint was moral even if the act was not, and he worked with an efficiency that had once been praised in boardrooms. A strip of cloth to still her voice, cords that were not tight enough to bruise but tight enough to tell her power had migrated elsewhere. The room swallowed her protests. He left a bottle of water within sight because he wanted her to understand this wasn't cruelty born of chaos, it was choreography. Nate noticed the absence first as an interruption in his own pulse rather than a calendar gap. Audra's life was loud with motion, but it was also meticulously documented, and when that documentation stalled, no reply to the message she always answered within 5 minutes, no red receipt where there was always at least a typo, 2 back-to-back missed calls that stacked themselves like warnings, he felt the old training resurrect in him, the clinical algorithm that translates worry into steps. He did not panic, he proceeded. He checked security footage he shouldn't have accessed and found nothing at the usual exits, which told him more than something would have. If no camera recorded her leaving, then either she had left in a way that avoided cameras or she had not left at all, and both scenarios were declarations in a language he understood. He called the front desk with the ease of an executive accustomed to permission, asked for a guest manifest he had no right to see, and crossed off names he knew by habit until only 2 remained that bothered him. Vendors associated with a discreet maintenance contractor Kyle had recommended last quarter and a third-party storage company that had recently invoiced a division he didn't recognize. He clicked, he traced, he made quiet requests that sounded like favors and felt like directives, and the thread pulled taut. The story the numbers told was inelegant but obvious. Someone had signed a temporary access pass for a window between meetings when the building hums and never pauses. Someone had used a sub-basement door that disappointed cameras often ignored. Someone had walked through that door with a woman who looked like Audra and then, an hour later, without her. Nate zoomed in on the frame where the man's face smeared into the digital grain, and even in the blur there was a posture he knew too well, shoulders carrying entitlement like a second jacket, chin tilted the way it tilts when a man is both performing and hiding. And he said the name aloud in a room that only answered with the sound of air. Kyle. Perhaps some part of him had expected it, perhaps none of him had been ready. Either way, the knowledge did not freeze him, it forced him forward. Kyle had not meant to keep Audra long. In the fantasy he never admitted to himself, the abduction was a raised mirror, 24 hours of silence to reflect the damage she had done, then an exit that left her shaky and him vindicated without anyone learning which story she would not be able to spin. But vengeance does not keep appointments, and by the time the first night turned itself into morning inside that windowless room, something had shifted. He had not touched her beyond constraint, yet he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and that truth made him reckless in a new way. Once you see yourself as the villain, an awful freedom arrives. Still, the rest of him clung to the illusion of control. He checked texts that arrived from Claire that he did not answer, texts written with a careful neutrality that wounded him more than accusation because neutrality is what people give when they are training themselves not to love you anymore. He watched the building from a car that smelled like a rental because it was one, noting who entered and who did not, waiting for a pattern to break. It broke when Nate appeared at an hour he usually reserved for meetings with people he disliked, moving with a focus that told Kyle this would not be a conversation. Kyle felt the first sour bite of doubt and told himself he could still end it on his terms, he could still open the door, apologize with a composed cruelty that made apology sound like strategy, and walk away before the shape of the crime hardened around him. He waited too long to decide. Nate did not hesitate in the corridor where the air felt different, as if some room had been consuming oxygen and producing fear. He moved past a locked door with the kind of certainty people mistakenly call instinct when it is really the math of experience, found the keypad that was not original to the frame, and instead of testing combinations like a television character he did the boring thing that often works. He looked for fingerprints on the glossy plastic, smudges clustered around 4 numbers, then worked through the permutations until the latch surrendered with an unflattering little sigh. The room greeted him with the sight he had already rehearsed and dreaded, Audra bound to a chair with a gag that turned her voice into a sound humans have been making since Caves and Danger first shook hands with one another. He crossed to her with movements that felt both very fast and very slow, because time splits open when adrenaline performs surgery on it, and he cut the cords at her wrists first because hands are how people return to themselves, then the cords at her ankles, and only then the gag, which he removed gently because gentleness is the first language you owe to someone who has been translated into an object. Audra began to cry the way people cry when their body finds out before their mind that survival is allowed again, the spasmodic sobs that embarrass the person making them and humble the person hearing them. She thanked the God she still argued with, clinging to Nate with the embarrassment of a woman who prides herself on never clinging to anything but leverage, and he held her with a steadiness that had nothing to do with optics. He asked no questions at first. Triage begins with breath and water and the reacquaintance of knees with standing. When she could speak without choking on the past 30 hours, she told him the outline Kyle would later deny with a precision that made denial sound like a strategy seminar. A decoy document, a wrong corridor, a door that closed with the unassuming finality of a bureaucratic error, cords that did not bruise but did not yield, a water bottle placed too far away to be kindness, the absence of a face more terrifying than any insult he could have delivered. Nate folded each detail into the ledger in his head and set aside the part of himself that wanted to hunt immediately, because rage is easy and restoration is work. Outside, the city pretended nothing had happened, the way cities do, but the moment had already changed the gravity between three people who had not been able to admit, even to themselves, how durable their connection had become. Kyle told himself that if Audra walked out under her own power, then what he had done could be recategorized as a lesson rather than a felony. And if a thought like that can live inside a person without suffocating their conscience, then perhaps conscience was never the organ he thought it was. He returned to the room because endings, like beginnings, are not supposed to be delegated, and stopped 10 feet from the door when he recognized he was already too late. The lock stood open in a way locks never open themselves, and the absence on the other side was louder than any alarm. He did not run. He pivoted with the cool calculation of a man who has traded too long on his ability to improvise and began to construct the speech he would deliver if confronted. A speech about fear, about intimidation, about a bluff that went too far but caused no physical harm, a speech calibrated to the ears of people who have learned to believe that harm counts only when it leaves a mark. He did not notice that his own breathing had quickened until it scraped like sand. He made 2 calls that rang and did not pick up, one to a lawyer he had no reason to need yet and one to a friend he believed would choose him even if it cost them their own reputation. And in those unreturned rings he heard a first draft of isolation. Nate, meanwhile, had already moved from rescue to reckoning. He contacted no police at first, and if that choice seems damning, it is also explicable. He had worked too long near power not to understand how quickly a complaint becomes a negotiation when the accused is wealthy and the victim is entangled with him in business and rumor. He cleaned the evidence that mattered, rope fibers, adhesive residue, the normal debris of abnormal control, and left the evidence that mattered more. An intact memory in a woman who would not be gaslit into doubting it, a series of timestamps that would anchor any story Kyle might later try to float, and the quiet retrieval of access logs that would be expensive for anyone to explain away. He brought Audra to a place where light entered windows like an apology and sat across from her not as a doctor and not as an executive but as a man who has already made a promise to himself he cannot help making out loud later. Anyone who did this will never be allowed to do it again. He did not press her toward vengeance when she was still shaking. He pressed her toward water and food and the treatment of wrists rubbed red in a way that would fade by morning but throb with memory for longer than he could convince her to admit. When she slept on a couch that had never held her before, he watched the rise and fall of her chest and discovered the strange intimacy of relief. What followed in the hours and days after was less a cascade than a tightening spiral. Rumors breed in any ecosystem built on secrets, and Genoa City is nothing if not fertile ground for rumors that acquire teeth. It began with a whisper at a coffee counter that Kyle and Audra had been seen arguing. It sharpened into a late-night text that used words like vanished and found. It metastasized into a boardroom where a junior executive who couldn't keep a secret if it was printed on his tie announced that a certain storage company's key records had been requested by someone with a last name that usually opens rather than closes doors. Jack heard the second version before he heard the first, and by the time he confronted his son in a corner office where the view made everyone feel smaller, the story he had assembled in his own head was already a tragedy he recognized from an earlier decade. Kyle didn't confess because men like Kyle don't believe confession is rational when denial still pays dividends. He parried, he minimized, he infected the air with a plausible ambiguity that made a father hesitate because hesitation is love's most reliable reflex. But even love cannot obscure every ink stain. And when Jack realized the particular chair Kyle described, its placement, its angle, the way the room compressed sound, he felt the terrifying certainty that comes from accidentally knowing a detail only a culpable person would know. He told himself he would fix this, because fathers tell themselves that until the world reminds them that some messes are not familial, they are criminal. Claire learned late and learned cleanly. A message delivered by someone who had grown tired of protecting reputations that did not protect them back. She did not respond. She did not return to the last exchange she and Kyle had shared because she understood that retroactive edits are just another way of lying to yourself. Instead, she allowed the grief to harden into a boundary, the kind of boundary that does not require performance or speech. If Kyle had kidnapped Audra to punish her for breaking him and Claire, his act had become proof that Claire had not broken him at all. He had always been cracked in places he refused to let the light name. That acknowledgement didn't offer comfort, but it gave her clarity, and clarity is the only bomb that doesn't expire. She told no one how she spent the next day. She owed no one that intimacy. For a while it looked as if the town's machinery would do what it always does: convert trauma into narrative, sell the narrative as perspective, and return everyone to their posts with a new layer of cynicism to keep them warm. But Nate would not permit the conversion this time. He confronted Kyle not in a hallway where witnesses could dilute the truth with their own agendas, but in a private space where the air had the weight of consequence. He did not shout. Shouting is a theater that flatters the person being shouted at. He laid out the facts like a surgeon places tools beside a body, precise, sequential, impossible to misinterpret, and then he named the intent that connected them. You took her. You restrained her. You left her there long enough for fear to become the dominant climate in her mind. You can claim you didn't bruise her. You did. This is what a bruise looks like when it doesn't show on skin. Kyle attempted the carefully engineered remorse of a man who still believes in the negotiability of truth. Nate ended the meeting before the performance could acquire a second act. When Kyle stepped into the corridor, he discovered that power feels different when people stop volunteering their awe. Audra did not return to work for several days, and when she did, she moved through the building with the cold hush of a storm's aftermath. People who had always loved her confidence now found it intimidating, but that was their problem, not hers. She met with counsel who did not know how to bill for rage and with advisors who understood reputation triage better than they understood human repair, and she listened while saying very little. The decision she had to make was not about headlines, it was about herself. Pursuing charges would drag her through a process that eats time and sleep and joy for breakfast. Not pursuing them would let Kyle file the whole episode in the cabinet he reserves for things the world lets men do when they're heartbroken. She did not choose that day. She gave herself permission to require more days than anyone expected, which is a revolution in a town where speed is mistaken for strength. She returned to Nate's place that night because the apartment knew her now, because the silence there was not trying to sell her anything, and because she could feel a new perimeter being constructed around the fear, a perimeter she was building herself. Kyle felt the perimeter, too, from the outside. The calls he placed were answered by assistants who had learned a very corporate gentleness that sounds like consent and is actually a boundary. The rooms he entered did not bend toward him with their usual elasticity. Even the mirror in his bathroom seemed to have developed a new, unflattering honesty. He could run, he could retaliate, he could confess, he could change. The first two were reflexes. The third was a fantasy. The fourth required an inventory he had never taken and wasn't sure he possessed. He drafted a statement he would never deliver, a poison pill apology that disguised itself as accountability, then tore it up because paper does not liberate you from yourself. He went to the storage room one last time, not to erase fingerprints but to look at the absence he had authored. He stood in the doorframe and realized that the most damning evidence was not in any fiber or smudge, it was inside the story he would have to tell himself every night to sleep. That he had been injured, that injury justified a lesson, that a lesson justified a crime. He stared at the chair until it became nothing again, just metal and vinyl and light, and still it accused him. In the weeks that followed, the city recalibrated the way cities do when scandal meets stamina. Some people decided Audra had invented the whole thing because they cannot survive in a world where charming men do monstrous things. Others decided Kyle was irredeemable because they cannot survive in a world where context complicates culpability. The truth didn't consult either camp. It lived where it always lives, inside the bodies of the people who endured it, in the quiet decisions they make afterward when no one is grading them for bravery. Nate kept his promise without turning it into a billboard. He became the sort of sentinel who does not announce the hours he stands watch.